Okay, thanks. Hi, welcome to Videos from the Ville. I'm Professor Greenawalt, and this is State and Local Government, and today we're going to be looking at state constitutions. We find state constitutions are nothing more than the highest law made by a state, just like the federal constitution, the highest law made by the national government. And just like the federal constitution, a state constitution sets forth three things. They set forth government functions. What is the government to do? Number two, government structure. What structures are they using to do these things? And lastly, government procedures. Once we know what the government's going to do, we have the structures to do it, and then the procedures to do those things that the structures will follow. We find that all other law in a state is made under the authority of the state constitution and has to conform to the provisions of the Constitution. In constitutional law in America, we find that state constitutions are considered higher than all state laws, but lower than, of course, the U.S. Constitution and lower than all federal laws. So, I want to remind you to get out your PowerPoints and follow along with this video, and it'll be a more productive session, I think, that way for you. All right, let's take a look first at similarities of state constitutions. What do we have? 50 states. How are the state constitutions all the same? Well, we find similarities of state constitutions that all establish three branches of government. All establish three branches of government with powers to check the other branches. They all have separation of powers. They all have checks and balances. And you find that these concepts are embedded in every state constitution. Another similarity of all state constitutions is simply that they have the idea of popular sovereignty in them. The idea of popular sovereignty is that all public officials are elected by the people. And we find another similarity of all state constitutions is they all contain the principle of judicial review. Now we find judicial review, of course, at the federal level as well. Just like the U.S. Supreme Court has judicial review powers, so does the state Supreme Court have judicial review powers for the various states. Now, again, what is judicial review? Judicial review is the ability of the highest court to overturn legislation that's been passed by that government, passed at the national level, passed by Congress and signed by the president, at the state level, passed by the state legislature and signed by the governor. So remember how we get to judicial review. Remember, judicial review must have a variety of steps before it can be realized. Number one, there has to be a real conflict. You can't make up a conflict to test the constitutionality of a law. So you have to have a real disagreement, a real grievance. Number two, it has to take the form of a court case. It has to take the form of litigation. Number three, that litigation has to rise up through the system to the state Supreme Court, or at the national level, the U.S. Supreme Court. And number four, and finally, the highest court would have to consciously decide that they're going to invoke judicial review and they're going to strike down that law. So that's the process by which judicial review is utilized. All right, we said that the, let's see. We said that. Okay, another similarity of all state constitutions is they all have provisions for local government. They specify how local government is to be organized and what the powers of local government are to be. Lastly, all state constitutions have another similarity in that they all generally have a Bill of Rights. Now, most states' bills of rights simply resemble the Federal Bill of Rights. And remember, the Bill of Rights is nothing more and the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Now, let's see. We want to skip ahead through the PowerPoints to, let's take a look at the age of state constitutions. We find that the oldest state constitution is Massachusetts. Its state constitution dates back to 1780. Remember, when was the national constitution drafted? It was drafted in 1787 in Philadelphia. So here is the state constitution of Massachusetts, which goes back to 1780. We find that the state constitution of Massachusetts, therefore, is 7 years older than our U.S. Constitution. We find that 1/3 of the states have constitutions that were written in the 20th century. And since the end of World War II, 14 states have written new constitutions. So 1/3 of all the states have constitutions written in the 20th century. And since the end of the Second World War, 14 states have written new constitutions. Let's see. Let's look at the length of state constitutions. The average length of state constitutions is 26,000 words. That's 4 times longer than the U.S. Constitution. We find that the shortest constitution is Vermont, which only has 6,600 words. And the state constitution of Vermont, therefore, is about the same length as the U.S. Constitution. So the shortest state constitution, Vermont, is about the same length as the federal or the national constitution. Again, the average length of the state constitution is 26,000 words, 4 times as long as the national constitution. The longest state constitution at present is Alabama at 130,000 words. We find that that's interesting because until 1983, now remember, it changed in 1983. In 1983, the longest state constitution was Georgia. Georgia's state constitution at that time was 600,000 words. 600,000 words is about the same length as Gone with the Wind, the novel Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. But just think in those states how difficult it must be to be a state constitutional lawyer. Okay. We find that, of course, our state constitutions grew up as a result of our prior history. We find that, of course, our founding fathers came from Europe. They bring over the traditions and heritage. They bring over their forms of government, and you find that they, if their country had a constitution, they would bring over those ideas as well. Let's look at some of the first constitutions that existed in the New World. We find that, of course, we find that here in Pennsylvania we had a very interesting situation because what was Pennsylvania? Pennsylvania was a state that was owned by a family. It was a proprietary colony. It was owned by the, of course, by the Penn family. And we find that William Penn came to Pennsylvania for the first time in 1682. When he did, he wrote on his voyage over the Atlantic something called the Frame of Government. Frame of Government we still have. It is in the rare book room in the archives in the State Library. And we find that it's posted generally once to twice a year for the public to take a look at. But the Frame of Government was William Penn's constitution for Pennsylvania, as it were. So it was our first state constitution. We find, of course, the Mayflower Compact was a form of a state constitution for the Pilgrims who came to Massachusetts. So these are some examples of some early constitutions. We find that when we're looking at Pennsylvania, though, that Pennsylvania's, some of its subsequent constitutions, we had a outstanding one that was written in 1776. And Pennsylvania's Constitution of 1776 was written by Ben Franklin. And we find that this begins to be considered a model state constitution. You want to know how to write a state constitution? Look at Pennsylvania's. Look at what Ben Franklin did in 1776. In fact, this model state constitution was used quite a bit by the founding fathers as they wrote the national constitution in 1787. I find that when other states were looking at how to write and go about formulating, drafting a state constitution, Pennsylvania's model state constitution, Pennsylvania State Constitution of 1776, served as a model state constitution from the beginning of the country all the way until 1928. In 1928, the National Municipal League, of all things, you'd think they'd be involved with mostly just local government, but the National Municipal League, 1928, they issued their own draft of a current model state constitution. That went undisturbed until 1968 when it was revised. So those are model state constitutions. We find that here in Pennsylvania, as we look at constitutions, we had our first then in 1682, the frame of government. We have another one, of course, by Benjamin Franklin in 1776. But we find that Pennsylvania's had 5 state constitutions. Find that Louisiana has written more state constitutions than any other state. They had 11 state constitutions. And of our 50 states, we find our 50 states have had more than 150 state constitutions since 1776. So our 50 states have had more than 150 state constitutions since 1776. Let's take a look at how we go about changing our state constitution. Well, we go about changing our state constitution through amendment process, don't we? Let's take a look at the amendment process. We find that all state constitutions can be changed through amendments. And the process is not so difficult. It's generally, to amend your state constitution, it's generally a 2-part process, a 2-stage process. Generally, you have an initiation where you have the decision made that you want to try to look at the Constitution closely and change it. The most common way to initiate a state constitutional amendment is by a vote of the state legislature. You generally need a supermajority. You generally need the House and the Senate to vote for one supermajority or another, whichever the state uses. Some states use a 2/3 vote, some states use a 3/5 vote, some states use a 3/4 vote. But the most common way for initiation is by a supermajority vote. And then we find that there's the second stage is ratification. Once the state legislature says, okay, we are going to consider amending the state constitution, then it's up for a vote of the voters of the state. And they have to have a majority of voters of the state vote for it in a general election. Now, in Pennsylvania, it's even more difficult to change the state constitution because a constitutional amendment has to be passed by 2 general assemblies, by 2 sessions of the legislature. So a session of the General Assembly lasts 2 years. So it's best to do it at the end of one and the beginning of the other. Because if you need 2 sessions and each session is 2 years, it gets so difficult. So you do it at the end of one session and you do it at the beginning of the other session. And then the people have to approve it as well. So Pennsylvania makes state constitutional amendments a little bit more difficult by having to have been done twice. Well, what is the frequency of amendments? The state that has amended their state constitution the most frequently, hands down winner, is South Carolina. South Carolina has amended their state constitution more than 450 times, and that's just since it's been adopted in 1895. So since 1895, South Carolina has amended their state constitution 450 times and lead that category. In second place is Alabama and California. They've amended their state constitutions more than 400 times. In third place is New York and Texas. New York and Texas have amended their state constitutions more than 200 times. The easiest constitutions to amend are ones that require, rather than a supermajority of the state legislature, they would require only a majority of the state legislature, not a supermajority, and only a majority of the electorate, a majority of the voters, to ratify it. So those are the ones that are easiest to change. We find that the current rate of change is, we find, about 3/4 of all state constitutions. About 75% of all state constitutions are changed in some way each year, and this activity would total about 200 state constitutional amendments. So each year there are about 200 state constitutional amendments. So 3/4 of all state constitutions are changed in some way each year, 75%. We find that there are other ways to change a constitution as well, and this is through revision of constitutions. One, we can have a new state constitutional convention. Now, when we have a new state constitutional convention, generally you're looking at starting over, and that may be what the state wants to do. Generally, more and more, we're bringing into focus something called a limited state constitutional convention, and that would be one that was set up specifically to look at one area of the state constitution and none other. But sometimes it's very difficult to limit any constitutional convention to just one area. Remember what happened at Philadelphia. All those delegates were going to Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. They weren't going to write a new constitution whatsoever. And after 2 weeks, they threw out that charge of revision of the Articles of Confederation, and they decided to write an entirely new document. They did not have authority to do that. They were not issued that charge when they were sent from their home state capitals. Okay. Well, it's the problem with all state constitutional conventions. Generally, the focus will fall on the entire Constitution rather than on a single isolated issue. We find that when a state wants to join the Union, they have to write a new Constitution, and that new Constitution has to be approved by Congress before that state or that territory can be allowed into the country as a state. Some states have what is called the automatic review provision. I love this, and I wish Pennsylvania would have it. We have 14 states that currently have this provision. And what happens with the automatic review provision is that every so many years, the people of the state are simply asked, do you want a new state constitutional convention? The average span of time is 20 years. wouldn't it be nice once every 20 years for the people of Pennsylvania to be asked, would you like to have a new state constitutional convention, yes or no? And I think maybe 20 years is even too short of a time. Maybe it should be every 30 years, something like that. You find that there are 14 states that have this. One state actually uses 16 years. 4 states actually use 10 years. So these are the periods of time. But this simply recognizes it's the right of the state population. It's the right of the people to alter their constitution. Now, one other way that state constitutions can be changed is revision by interpretation. And all 3 branches of government can revise the state constitution. The judiciary, of course, the legislature, and the governor, or executive interpretation. Well, judicial interpretation, we all know that what are constitutions? Constitutions are whatever the state Supreme Court says, or at the national level, whatever the U.S. Supreme Court says. That's what the constitutions are, according to common practice, right? So the courts get to interpret state constitutions, and they get to change state constitutions. So constitutions are whatever the state Supreme Courts say they are. But we find that constitutions can also be interpreted by the legislature. For example, we find that a number of years ago, well, let's go to executive interpretation for a moment first. Executive interpretation is that the state constitution can be changed to interpretation by the governor. And one example of that would be with, for example, Tom Ridge. Tom Ridge said at one point, when faced with the issue of statewide gambling casinos, he said, okay, he was opposed to them, but he said, okay, I'll sign that bill into law if, number one, everybody in the state has a right to vote, and they decide by a majority to go for this. And then he said, but we're going to couple this with wherever a casino is to be located, the majority of people in that area must vote and approve of it as well. And so that was his word. I had a member of my board from Susquehanna Valley Center, Bob Long, a great lawyer who's passed now, but he was a law school intern at the last state constitutional convention run by former Governor Bob Casey in Harrisburg. He was a law student at Dickinson, and he was at that state constitutional convention. And when Tom Ridge said that, he came to the next board meeting and said, Tom Ridge is giving the people of Pennsylvania the right of a binding referendum, that they get to vote, and whatever they decide becomes law. And the state constitution doesn't allow that. And so we had to send a delegation to Governor Ridge, and lo and behold, they went and examined the notes from the State Constitutional Convention in the archives, and they came back and said we were right. And Governor Ridge wasn't able to do that, but here he was going to be changing the Constitution of Pennsylvania just through his interpretation, giving the people the right to vote on something, and then saying that would be binding, when in fact we don't allow that. Well, lastly is legislative interpretation that I paused on a moment ago. Legislative interpretation just simply means that the state constitution is whatever the legislature says that it is. This can be found in votes that the state legislature takes from time to time on the constitutionality of some law or another. Anytime the state legislator is voting on the constitutionality of an issue or another, you can fairly well believe that what they are doing is they are trying to avoid the issue. They don't want to go on the records as voting for or against something, and they're trying to get around it. That's why you vote on the constitutionality of something or not. You don't want to vote on that particular issue. Again, back in the Ridge years, we found that the Republicans controlled the legislature, and they were all for school choice. Well, they were for school choice theoretically, but when a bill went forward in the General Assembly, you found that those bills didn't get through the state house because there were many state House Republicans who said, yes, we're for school choice, but they didn't vote for it. They voted for a bill that said that it wasn't constitutional. So they could continue to support school choice, but they could say, no, this bill isn't constitutional. Their major problem was that they were afraid that if the children in the inner city had a chance to vacate their school districts, that those children would leave en masse and come to the suburbs and flood those school districts with minority children. And they hadn't needed to fear quite so much because those districts could only take so many children, number one, and number two, it would have been a good thing for terrible school districts to lose the children, lose the funding, and realize that they're not measuring up and try to take a look at what they're doing badly and what they need to improve. Okay? Well, if you have any questions on state constitutions, give me a ring, call my cell phone, email me, text me, or FaceTime me, and I'd be happy to try to answer. Okay? We'll be back with another subject in state and local government in just a minute.